Hi, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Ollett. And hi, Katie, what's today's mathematical object?
Today's mathematical object is the game of Dobble, which is a children's game. I think it's released in America as Spot It, or in some other countries, but in the UK it's called Dobble for no known reason. But it comes in a little tin. I've got a tin here, I'll just take the lid off. And it contains a set of round cards, which is already quite a curious object. Cards are rectangular, I don't understand this. But the idea of this game is each card has a set of symbols on it. It's got 8 different pictures on each card, and there's a variety of different symbols. But the idea is that if you're playing this game and you pick out 2 of the cards, the instructions include various different ways to play. So, do you each have a pile of cards that you work through, or is there a pile in the middle? And there's various different versions of the game you can play. But the idea fundamentally is that when you've got 2 cards in front of you, there is exactly one symbol that occurs on both cards. In this case, it's a little purple bird on the 2 cards that I'm looking at here. But it could be any one of the symbols. And obviously, as a fun game, this is lovely. It's quite good. It gets a bit violent if you've got enough people who really care about winning, that they're all shouting symbols at the same time. But I think it's mathematically interesting. I've seen it described as surprisingly mathematical, given that it is literally just some cards with pictures on. And I guess part of the reason for that is that it's sort of simpler than it should be, I guess. So Matt Parker's just done a really good YouTube video in which he goes into all of this, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But I guess the idea is that if you wanted to design a game like this, you could say, okay, each card needs to have each pair of cards needs to have one symbol in common. So I could just say, for each pair of cards in my game, I want to put a symbol that is just on those 2 cards. And you could design it that way. But the problem with that is you would need quite a lot of symbols, because in a set of, 10 cards, there are 10 choose 2 pairs of cards. In the case of Dobble, there's over 50 cards in the deck, so you would need thousands. You need over 1,000 symbols in order to do that.
And in terms of the gameplay, you would need the same symbol to keep recurring, because you need people to get familiar with these symbols and be able to spot them.
Yeah, exactly. If you had a distinct symbol for each pair of cards, then you'd basically run out of common household objects for the symbols to be pictures of.
Yes.
You'd just be like, are those called calipers? I don't know. But yeah, so this is very much like tree, house, car, hat or whatever. So the way that Dobble does it, actually, is that the number of symbols that it needs is the same as the number of cards, basically. You can actually kind of collapse the whole thing in on itself, so that instead of having distinct symbols for each pair, you can use the same symbols, but it's possible to set it up so that you get this unique symbol for each pair of cards. And I guess the thing that's important is that for 2 cards you're looking at, there is only one symbol that occurs on both cards. Like, the same symbol can occur in other pairs, but for any particular pair of cards, you don't have 2 symbols that are on both.
So you're seeing 2 of this pink dog or whatever it was,
yeah,
and 7 other symbols which are different on each card.
Yeah, there's no other match between the 2 cards.
But you could find another card that matched each of those symbols. The 7 that don't match on these 2, there's another card that matches them, is that right?
Yeah, and in fact any third card that I bring in will have a match with both of those cards, but it will be a different symbol for each case.
Yeah.
That one's the key. Now, I have to do it now. That one's the exclamation mark. So, the main challenge with this game is remembering what objects are called, because you're trying to shout out what the thing is, and you're like, it's the thing with the... Yeah.
And it's a game of sort of speed and slightly memory and kind of noticing, isn't it? Games are often in this sort of thing where they're mathematically interesting either in the way that they're played or in the design of the game. And this is definitely a design of the cards kind of interest, I think. Yeah,
I guess. And it's the sort of thing where, if you've got a curious person who wants to make their own version of something, because you might want to do a game where it's just pictures of your family or whatever, you could design a smaller version of this. So you could say, okay, I'm just going to have, 7 cards or something. And in that case, you can do this. Like, you can create this structure on a smaller scale. And I think 7 is a good example here, because there's a really nice sort of analogue for this. So, as always, trying to describe a visual thing on a podcast. So you imagine you've got a triangle, say, an equilateral triangle, so it's a nice symmetrical shape, and you've got a point at each corner of the triangle, and then you also add in a point at the middle of each edge of the triangle. So that gives you 3 in the corners and 3 on the edges. And then you want to draw like a circle that touches the 3 midpoints, so it kind of sits inside the triangle. It's sort of like the Harry Potter thing, and because I think that's also got a vertical line down the middle. So you want that vertical line, and then you also want the other 2 sort of diagonal lines coming up from the bottom corners of the triangle to the midpoint of the opposite side. So if anyone sat there with a pen and paper has just sketched that, you can now see what we're looking at. But this is actually a structure that has the same structure as Dobble, but on a smaller scale. So this is one where it's an imaginary game of Dobble with 7 cards, and there's sort of 2 ways around you can do this. But let's say each of the points on the diagram is one of the cards, and it contains 3 symbols, because each point in this diagram has 3 lines that go through it. And if you've got the picture in front of you, you can hopefully see that. But if not, you've got the corners of the triangle have got the 2 edges of the triangle coming in and the vertical or otherwise line that goes straight into that point. And the ones on the edges have got the edge of the triangle that they're on and the circle that they're on and the diagonal or vertical that goes into that point.
So let me just check I've got that. So the corners each connect to 2 other corners and 1 midpoint. So that's their 3 lines. And the midpoints are on a line that joins the 2 corners that they're the midpoint of, and they connect to the corner opposite them, and they connect to the circle in the middle. That's the thing. So it's not that they've got 3 lines coming in, because the midpoints have 5 lines, don't they?
Yeah, I guess.
But they're kind of on 3 of the lines.
Yeah. And also, in fact, if you've done this, you'll have made a 7th point right in the centre of the object that's got the 3 straight lines crossing at it.
And that's also a card.
That's also a card as well. So those are our 7 cards, and the lines, I guess, correspond to the symbols. But it's sort of weird because you can kind of do it the other way around as well if you want. You can say that lines correspond to cards and the points correspond to symbols. But let's say there's a card at each point, and the lines that it's got coming through it are the 3 symbols that are on it. So each symbol is on 3 cards, but for any 2 cards, in this case, you have 1 unique symbol that will be on both of those cards. And you can check, you can go through and check that this works. But if you want to make, family Dobble, you get 7 pictures of your family members' faces and put 3 of them on each card in this arrangement, and you will have this game. And in fact, it's part of a much larger and more complicated area of maths, which is, I think it's kind of a sub-branch of combinatorics. But it's sort of combinatorics where you have additional constraints. So in this case, we're looking for, you've got a set of things, you want to split it into smaller sets, such that if I say, for instance, every 2 things have to occur in exactly 1 set, I guess, which is equivalent to each set has 1 thing in common. And there's all kinds of different types of things here. So a Steiner system is an example of one of these things, where you have a particular set of constraints on them. And I think the particular constraint for a Steiner system is that everything occurs in 1 time, whereas you could have, each pair of cards has exactly 2 symbols in common. That would be a different constraint that you could put on. You can also have a further constraint, which is that you're looking for just pairs of cards to match, but you could say every 3 cards has a symbol in common. That's a different way you could vary it. In the case of where you're looking for 2 cards to have a symbol in common, you get a finite projective plane, which is what we've got here. And this 7-point example is a thing called the Fano plane, or the Fano plane, however Fano's name is pronounced. And this is like a really nice classic example of it. But you can take, in general, you will have, if you've got 2 things in common, you'll have q plus 1 symbols on each card and q squared plus q plus 1 cards, and equivalently q squared plus q plus 1 symbols. So it's got that sort of nice symmetry to it. The number of cards is the same as the number of symbols. And that's sort of how those numbers are related.
Can we talk a little bit about the Fano plane, how you say it? That because this thing is dots and lines and looks like a graph, but it's not a graph, right? What's going on?
Well, it's sort of, it's kind of, so it's called a finite projective plane because it's kind of like you've taken a plane and sort of wrapped it round into itself so it becomes finite, I guess. And a projective here means, so in the case of an infinite projective plane, you could have something like the regular Euclidean 2-dimensional plane, And to make it into a projective plane, you essentially take the edges of it and glue them together, which feels quite difficult because it's infinite, but you use what's called a point at infinity, which you sort of say that, as all the, if you've got, say, two lines that are going off into the distance, they will meet at infinity, I guess, like a sort of perspective thing. And all of those points at infinity are just the same point, and you kind of glue it together, and it kind of wraps it round into a thing that, it's not finite, obviously, because it's still an infinite plane, but it's sort of more compact, I guess, in a mathematical sense. And these finite projective planes are versions of it where, instead of it being in an infinite plane, it's just a sort of set of lines and points. But they still have this structure that it's sort of a projective plane, so you've got this neat property where every line goes through 3 points and every point lies on 3 lines, kind of thing.
I think one thing that slightly confused me, because over the years I've heard lots of people talk about maths of Dobble, and it's never quite clicked totally for me, but one of the things that confused me for a bit was that the circle in the middle is not really different from any of the other lines, and the other lines are straight.
Yeah.
But one thing, because basically all the lines pass through 3 points, and the circle passes through 3 points. What's slightly weird about the circle is that it joins back to the original point, whereas the edges of the triangle and the diagonals across the triangle don't loop back onto the original point that they started at. Although they could, they just don't, right?
Yeah, they could do. There's no point in drawing that bit because it doesn't give you any extra information. And in fact, you could just leave out one section of the circle, right? You could just stop the line before you got back to where you started.
And the reason you don't do that is because it looks nice and symmetrical and
yeah.
stuff. But in some way, you could shuffle the points around here to make the circle into a straight line and make one of the straight lines into the circle in the middle, right? It's sort of a mutable thing like that.
Yeah, you can imagine that being animated somehow, just the whole thing kind of morphing inside out such that it changes which one is in the middle. And I guess, if you've got a diagram where they're all different colours, you'd see the colours sort of moving around or whatever. But yeah, I think the fact that this has got that nice symmetry of 3 points on each line and 3 lines through each point is part of the fact that it's this particular constrained type of... they're called block designs, partly because the idea is you're splitting a thing into groups where the groups all have properties that they're referred to as blocks. But it's part of this whole, as I say, bigger subset of combinatorics. And I guess the origins of it, the history of it, is that there's a really classic old problem about this called the Kirkman schoolgirls problem, which is one of these terribly Oven-era problems where for some reason it's schoolgirls. But anyway, the original statement is something like 15 young ladies in a school walk out 3 abreast for 7 days in succession. It is required to arrange them daily so that no 2 shall walk twice abreast. And it is, of course, very, very of the era. You can imagine it's 15 any people, and we need to put them into groups of 3, such that each day your arrangements are sufficiently different that you don't have 2 people in the same group twice. So this is, again, one of these conditions where it's what things are in what groups at what times. And obviously there's any number of different ways you can ask these questions.
The thing that seems quite obvious is to think about tournaments, right? Because then you need people to be arranged in different groups for matches.
Yeah, and yeah, a lot of the kind of maths of this has ended up feeding into that kind of those kinds of calculations. But it's the way that these block design structures are designed allow you to say for sure whether it's possible to solve a problem, and if a solution exists, what does it look like? Because this is literally, like, I've had friends ask me, oh, you do maths, can you help me with this problem? And I'm like, well, I don't do that specific type of maths, but I have got the internet, so I will do some Googling and I will find out the answer. And I literally had an email from one of my friends who said, okay, my dad's going on a golfing holiday with, there'll be 8 people on the trip, and they want to split into 2 groups of 4 each day, but they're going to play on 5 days, and they want to make sure that they're not just playing with the same people each day, so they want to be on the same team as each other at least twice, but not more than 3 times within the 5 games. And I did a bit of kind of maths and number crunching and tried to kind of find a block design that fit this, and I think the answer is no, that's not possible. Like, it's just not enough flexibility, and it's really sad email to send back, like, thank you for consulting me about this maths question. The answer is no. But I think I managed to get somewhere that was sort of a half solutions. So they did have a little bit of playing with the same people, but they did at least get to play with everyone at least a couple of times.
That's a nice idea for your holiday, but math says no.
Yeah, well, exactly, yeah. And yeah, combinatorial design theory is not your friend right now. But it was... For me, that was kind of an introduction to this, because it started me off looking into this, and I was like, oh, Kirkman's schoolgirls problem, does this help? No, it doesn't. But it's the same kind of idea, that you've got these constraints, and I guess the inventors of Dobble presumably didn't think about this. They weren't like, how can we implement a finite projective plane as a game? But they obviously came upon this when they were trying to work out how to put the symbols on the cards. So Dobble is... an example of a Steiner system where, if you remember, we had 2 q plus 1, q squared plus q plus 1 were the 3 variables. So Dobble, I think, is q equals 7. So you've got any 2 cards share a symbol, you've got 8 different symbols on each card, and you've got 7 squared plus 7 plus 1 is 57 cards and 57 symbols, which is a real bone of contention for some mathematicians, because actually Dobble doesn't have all 57 possible cards. They only actually print 55 of them for reasons unknown, and you can work out what the other 2 would be and produce them yourself and print them and put them in with your Dobble deck if you really care. But who knows why?
It's one of those things where some people take that to mean that the inventors of Dobble had no idea about projective planes and just stumbled on the right thing, some sort of computational process or trial and error or whatever. But there are also ways of viewing this where you think maybe the people who make these weird round cards could more efficiently make them in batches of 55 than 57 for whatever reason.
Well, yeah, it's hard to say. And in fact, they definitely do know about it, because in with the game of Dobble, inside the tin, there's a little bit of paper that's got a little description of a bit of the history of the game. And it's based on an original game where it was pictures of insects on a card, and you had to find the matching pairs of insects, and I think that's based on a projective plane of order 5 instead of 7. And it also mentions the Kirkman schoolgirls problem and some of the types of maths that this connected to. It says, with help of techniques developed from theories of error correcting codes, the inventor of Dobble built structures which generalised the problem and are well known by mathematicians under the name of incomplete balanced blocks. So they definitely are aware of the maths behind this. And yeah, the Dobble game is available in different versions. So they've actually done Kids Dobble, which, as you can imagine, is simpler and has fewer cards. I think they've gone for a base, I think that's base 5, so they've got 31 cards and 6 symbols on each card. There's also, I think there's Beach Dobble, which is a waterproof version, which also has 31 cards. But I think there's only 30 in there, which very much does sound like a printing constraint, because who's printing 31 of something when you can print a 6x5 rectangle of cards, especially with the circular cards. I mean, They didn't need to be circular. They could have made their own lives easier with that. But I guess it's because it means then they don't have a definite way up. So whichever way you're looking at it, you've got an equal chance of spotting the symbols, because they're all arranged in different orientations and things. But yeah, I think it's just a really kind of neat fact that behind what seems like a really simple idea of just, can I put some pictures on a card? There's actually this, and it genuinely links into all of these different kinds of other questions as well, and you can extend it in different ways. Yeah.
Cool. Right, if you want to get in touch, we're on Twitter, where I'm at Peter Rowlett.
And I'm at Stex.
And the podcast itself is at Maths Objects. We both blog at aperiodical.com, where you can find more episodes.
And if you want to get in touch with us, if you've invented your own version of Dobble with, a set of double cards on each card, it turns out that is a thing you can do as well. But you meta Dobble, or whatever, if you want to get in touch, or if you have any suggestions for other objects. And I should say, actually, thank you to the person who suggested, it was Jonathan Wallington on Twitter, suggested that we talk about Dobble. But yeah, if you have an idea for an object that we should podcast about, then please email objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.